Hey, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining me. This is going to be a preview video for episode 8 of Anomalous America. Um, yeah, I can't believe we're 8 episodes in already. And this one is going to be a good one. It's going to be a little bit long for previews, but once we get into this article, you're going to see why. So, yeah, thanks again for joining me. And we're going to dive right in here. It's one of my favorites. I say that a lot, but it's true. Washington Times, 1922. First inhabitants of America, giants in physique, fought wild beasts in deadly combat 25,000 or 50,000 years ago. Weird relics show powerful humans erected pyramids. Mummies of prehistoric Aztecs found in ruins in New Mexico indicate giant men built monuments far more ancient and greater than ever produced. New light cast on remarkable race by Dr. W.H. Balu, a well-known writer on scientific subjects. The first inhabitants of America of which we have knowledge, because of the extraordinary, perfect mummies they left behind, are variously known as the basket makers and spear throwers. They lived underground in the Southwest with their dead mummified in sealed potholes of chambers well below the surface. Their successors built cliff houses over them and either perished or moved along. Then, on top of these cliff houses, came succeeding races who erected the more modern pueblo, of which the famous Mesa Verde, constructed 5,000 years ago, is the best known type. Incredibly important. We've been underlining this fact over and over throughout this series, and every one of the Four Corners videos has said something along these lines. All the cities of Arizona are built on top of buried cities. Um, the same is to be said for, um, the places we covered in Utah, buried cities, these gigantic mounds. One of the mounds in Colorado was 4 miles in circumference and was a giant city. So mounds are giant cities. These cities go underground. If you remember, the 2 buildings in Colorado were each a mile long. Gigantic, monumental sized buildings. But what is he saying? As we've been pointing out, we have succeeding races built on top of another race, built on top of another race. We're dealing with 3, and in my opinion, 4 levels of civilization. And back to the article. It is more than a quarter century since the Hyde expedition unearthed mummies of the basket makers below the cliff dwellings of Grand Gulch, Utah. We covered some of that. We talked about a little bit of that in our Utah episode. So if you haven't seen that, please go back and watch Anomalous America, Utah. More ancient than Egypt. Naturally, certain questions have ever since been puzzling archaeologists. How did these strange people reach Grand Gulch? Whence did they come? And to what early race or branch thereof do they belong? A little more light has been thrown on these early Americans by the discoveries of Dr. Eel H. Morris. There is centered in the American Museum of Natural History the Archer M. Huntington Archaeological Survey of Southwest, of which Dr. Clark Whistler, author of The American Indian, now in process of a new revised edition, is director. This survey has ample funds and a very large staff, generously financed by Mr. Huntington. It's issued its own publication. To Dr. Morris was assigned the task of tracing the wanderings of the basket makers and the route by which they got as far into the interior as Grand Gulch, Utah. He reasoned that he would only find basket makers' remains in cultures beneath pueblos, and his discoveries have proved him correct. In Aztec, New Mexico, he selected a great deserted city, or pueblo, of the usual skyscraper type of Zuni, New Mexico. Here he began excavations and entered cellar tombs so ancient that they make Egypt look modern. Indeed. Indeed, they do. They make Egypt look modern. We've been saying this again, all the way from our California episodes, even into Alaska. Make Egypt look modern. The chambers he opened were sealed not less than 25,000 years ago. Again, I don't necessarily agree with these time frames, but very ancient. And the mummies within were well preserved as when placed therein. His report to Dr. Weissler follows. Two chambers are the most interesting of the numerous recent discoveries in the Aztec ruin. An enormous prehistoric pueblo community dwelling near Aztec, New Mexico. And in the full episode, we'll get into this dwelling a little bit more. We'll talk about other things that were found in this area. Beneath the debris adjacent to the famous painted room opened in 1920, there has been found a second chamber, perfectly preserved. Let me zoom in a little bit more for you guys. I'm right here. Perfectly preserved in every detail. The pine and cedar beams in the smoked brown ceiling are as sound as when the trees were felled. And remember, back through the episodes, we've covered that cedar is not even found anywhere anymore. And we've talked about some of the biblical references in Colorado and Utah that mention the cedars and the ancient cedars, and important things to note. As when the trees were felled, and on the walls, stones, the marks of the quartzite pebbles with which they were faced are as bright and fresh as if the artisan who shaped the blocks, although dead these thousands of years, had not yesterday gathered up his primitive tools and stamped out the finished chamber. This room was the tomb of a gigantic warrior emperor who lay in solitary state against one wall immediately back of the recessed altar in the painted room. The body was that of a veritable giant, 6 feet 4 inches high. Now, again, that may not strike you as a giant in some of these other articles that I cover, but what you have to remember is that now these giants, these red-headed giants that we've been finding, now that we found in California, we found in Colorado, we found them in Utah, we found them in Arizona. They're 1 to 2 feet larger than the people that they're found buried with. Some of these mummies, adult mummies, are 4 feet tall. So this gentleman here at 6'4", and remember, and during this process they shrink a considerable amount, 3, 4, 5 inches sometimes. 6 feet 4 inches high, who towered head and shoulders above the average men of this tribe. Yes, like I was saying. Death came to the stalwart defender of the village when he was in the prime of his life and in the height of his glory as well. If one may infer the esteem in which he was held by the excellence of his tomb and the number of his burial accompaniments. The mighty frame had been wrapped in a mantle of feather cloth and enshrouded with a mat of woven rush stems. 2 battle axes. Back of the body, there were 4 magnificent pottery bowls, a cup, and a basket. Upon the skull rested a large spherical vase with a neatly fitted cover, both exquisitely wrought and ornamented. Within easy grasp of the right hand were the wooden handles of 2 stone battle axes, and by them a handcrafted knife of quartzite, as well as chips of flint and prongs of antler, the latter materials and implements for arrow making. A circular shield, 3 feet in diameter, unlike anything previously found in Pueblo ruins, covered the warrior from thigh to temple. It is an example of coiled basketry technique, the most primitive known, but unusually thick and strong. The outer surface, this is important, the outer surface had been coated with gum and thickly spangled with flakes of mica. When held in the sunlight, due to the numberless reflecting surfaces, the great disk would have shone with dazzling brilliance, perhaps sufficiently intense to have confused the vision of the archer who sought to drive his arrow through the shield to the flesh behind it. Of 13 mummies found in an adjoining chamber, one was the most extraordinary which has come to light in the entire ruin. This was the mummy of an old woman who had been wrapped and bound in the usual burial position and then placed in one corner of the room. A stout splinter from a broken ceiling timber had been hewn to a point, then driven completely through the pelvis and well into the earth beneath. Ancient witch impaled. The shrunken body thus impaled presented a spectacle so gruesome that a sight of it even the hardened excavator shuddered. It seems probable that the old woman had fallen into disfavor in the villages and had perhaps been a witch and had been subjected to this extraordinary and cruel form of torture and execution. This gigantic warrior emperor of the basket makers is well named Tigrinus. Dr. Whistler informed me that we have here the actual founders of the Aztec and Bonita culture, unless later excavations prove differently. Tigrinus must stand as the first emperor of the founders of the Aztecs, whose later and wonderful structures adorned central Mexico in a line extending toward the Yucatan, and which extended eastward on the lost continent of Atlantis, the famed Atlantis of Plato. Now, if you've been following my work over, the last, few months, maybe a few years even, I've been discussing at length that Atlantis, or a remnant of Atlantis, was the Gulf of Mexico, from Florida to Texas to the Yucatan and all in between. And that the entire area was indeed the Fertile Crescent. And this just gentleman is in agreement with that. 250,000-year-old race. The basket makers, of which the Emperor Tigrinus was a symbol, were a Tahitian or red-headed race. At least all their mummies so far brought to the American Museum have reddish, wavy hair. Now again, Utah, Colorado, California. Red-headed men, over 6 feet average, 6'4", 6'6", 6'8", with red hair, buried with 3.5, 4.5 foot people with black hair. Very interesting. Even some wavy hair. I think we have at least um, three different phenotypes in this area living together. If they were the founders of the Aztecs must be as summed to have been the first Tahitian-haired people on Earth of which we have knowledge. The hair color and the cross sections show positively that these first Americans never migrated here from Asia, a land of straight black-haired people. In the extreme north, we have the yellow-haired Yaris of ancient history and the blood types of today, but red hair seems to be a separate and distinct characteristic, not necessarily associated with the blonde-haired. We have ample evidences that the ancient civilizations of Mexico, Yucatan, and storied Atlantis date back at least 250,000 years from the true Garden of Eden of the world. Fossil skeletons of Florida, Rancho Brea, and the caves of California prove the contention of exceeding age of mankind along the American equatorial belt and that they evolved here. I agree. We talked about La Brea in the California video. We talked about The caves of California. We talked about mummies from California all through the four corners. And we're going to get to Florida in this series eventually. And boy, it's going to get really good. We're going to talk about red-headed giant mummies there as well. Tigrinus was better armed than his followers in the Grand Gulch, Utah. The latter had for weapons only throwing sticks, just strong enough to kill a rabbit. They were easy prey for wild beasts, and hence took to underground dwellings for safety. Tigrinus, on the contrary, was equipped with the most primitive stone battle axes of which we have knowledge. My apologies. Tigrinus, on the contrary, was well equipped. His shield was of coiled basketry or coiled matting, the very first and most primitive type of basketry and matting on earth. Spirit of unrest. We see in his people the same unrest, the same spirit of adventure and desire to pioneer into the unknown regions as characterized every race of people in all times. Those that vanished northward from Mexico all perished one after another. In one cave in Grand Gulch, 250 feet down from the top of the cliff dwellings, was shown the tragedy of the venturesome pioneers of 25,000 years ago. As death took place, the survivors mummified the bodies and placed them in potholes, which they dug in the floors of the caverns. These potholes were lined with baked clay, and the mummies were placed in them singly, doubled up in a squatting position, chin at knees. The mummy was covered with beautiful feathers, and sometimes with rabbit skins robes. Besides the men, women, and children were placed the simple, primitive type of arms, ornaments, clay dishes, and queer looking toys. On top was placed the coiled matting in shape of a modern woman's summer hat, the babes having little coiled mats to rest upon. The tops of the potholes were then sealed with tamped sand and clay, stamped. Finally, this band of pioneers was reduced to one old woman who had faithfully mummified the last survivor before her. When her time came, she crouched against a wall in a near mummy position as possible and died alone within the awful silence. The last survivor. But nature was kind to her. The dry air of the cave did its own mummification in a way. Her skeleton was found with its auburn hair intact, Her face had dried with its expression of pain, grief, and sorrow. Most of her body had been preserved in the dry air through many thousands of years in a cave which had been sealed by enormous accumulations of debris from above. As I look at it, these primitive founders of the Aztecs, called basket makers, were not especially engaged in tribal wars. Although there existed, even in those far back times, a banditry known as nomads, I assume that the prowess of the gigantic warrior Tigrinus was principally directed against wild beasts of his time. The Pleistocene age in America extended well down into the present age of man, with all of its species still existing. It was noted for its bears, lions, jaguars, wolves, vastly larger and fiercer than their survivors of today. The lions of those days were as large as modern oxen. And remember in the Arizona video, lions, not mountain lions, African lions, which originate here in America, were found in the caves of Arizona up until the 1800s. Men were coming to Arizona from all around the world to hunt lions. African, quote, African lions here in the American Southwest. The bears of the time, elephantine in size, were not the timid berry eaters of present, but ferocious carnivores, monsters of long ago. Even the huge Kodiak bear of Alaska is a small beast in comparison. The wolves that roamed were as big as 4 modern wolves, endowed with large fangs. Then there were the large saber-toothed tigers with long frontal tusks, the principal foe of the troglodytes. And you'll remember in my California episode, we go into the La Brea tar pits and we show that pygmies, giants, giant bears, giant sloths, giant saber-toothed tigers, giant mammoths, bigger than anything they found anywhere else, were found in the La Brea tar pits. We may well assume that Tigrinus was the chief of a band of the most stalwart warriors of his time. That when this band went out and was able to dispatch a gigantic bear, lion, wolf, or saber-toothed tiger, they had done layer work and returned to headquarters, a day's work, to celebrate the killing. But woe to the single individual, or even a few unarmed individuals who fell afoul of one of these ferocious beasts. The unhappy Aztec would be torn to pieces and devoured long before help could be summoned. Just how the warriors got the best of one of these beasts is a question. There were in those days no bows and arrows or stick throwers strong enough to penetrate the hides of these monsters. Stone knives and axes must have been but poorly efficient. We can only surmise that a large body of warriors surrounded a beast, each striking him a blow as he got opportunity, until the monster was exhausted and finally dispatched. How Tigrinus died. On the contrary, let us give the primitive soldier the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps our gigantic emperor warrior Tigrinus distinguished himself by combat single-handed with ferocious beasts and enemy tribal men, and came to be the chieftain who his country was proud to mummify with all the honors that could be paid to the dead. But how did he die? Dr. Morris, if he has held an autopsy on the remains, has given out no word of explanation. He merely states that death came to him in the prime of his life and glory. Hence, he may have died naturally with some disease prevalent or epidemic at his time. An enemy may have tapped him too hard on the skull, but Dr. Morris makes no mention of such a dent. Or he may have encountered a love triangle and been stabbed in the back. But here again, his discoverer makes no notation. So we may assume that after a career equal to that of Attila, Genghis Khan, or other assassins of note, he merely died in his boots, figuratively speaking, since the coiled mat sandal was about $20 shoe at his time. It must be noted, however, that his enemies, the wild beasts of the time, had plenty of fresh meat or herds of American horses and mastodons, the later being since extinct, on which bears, lions, wolves, jaguars, and saber-toothed cats feasted. There is also evidence that the primitive basket makers themselves feasted on such horses as they could kill, since we find their bones with the marrow taken out at the time of killing, and marrow is good eating to those who like it. And we've talked about primitive horses. All the horses of the world come from the American horse. The horses originated here. The oldest skeletons come from America. Aztec is located on the property of H.D. Abrams, about 2 hours' ride by rail from Durango, Colorado. The skyscraping pueblo on a rise of ground covers 300 square feet and has 400 rooms. The greater part has been uncovered and exposed to view of hundreds of tourists. The pueblo on top of the ancient cellar homes was erected some 10,000 years ago, and its front is protected by a high plaza, which could not be invaded by any enemy or wild beasts after the ladders were taken up. The painted chamber. The builders lived in a primitive Stone Age, and all of their implements and tools were made of stone. The rooms were cleaned of debris and found in a perfect condition, just as left by their last occupants. The ceilings were standing, and many objects were left intact by the former inhabitants. The most stunning room of the great Aztec pueblo on earth is the painted chamber. Dr. Whistler states, the room is in perfect condition, the interior plastered and painted in brilliant white, with dull red side borders and a running series of triangular designs. No room approaching this beauty and perfection has ever been discovered in America. Here was the holiest sanctum or shrine of the prehistoric people. Herein is the sacred altar, with a sacred serpent carved in wood over the ceiling of the finest workmanship. Nothing like it has ever been found before. Built first pyramids. It is beneath the ruins of this magnificent pueblo that the present excavations are being made by blasting holes through the solid floors and excavating the chambers of the long prior race of basket makers. Herein, the startling types of mummies are being found, described above. From these wonderful preserved mummies of 25,000 or perhaps 50,000 years ago, there is one significant inference. These people must have been the forefathers of the migratory race that crossed then mainland of Atlantis and settled in Egypt. Let me repeat. These people must have been the forefathers of the migratory race that crossed the then mainland of Atlantis and settled in Egypt. Truly, Egyptian primitive culture was born here and later perfected on the banks of the Nile. Here also began the art of pyramid structure, and Mexico has far larger pyramids than were built in Egypt, the largest in the world. Some of them in the Yucatan far more perfected with ornamentation. It was in one of these Yucatan pyramids that La Pigeon unearthed a gigantic statue of Chicmul, which the Mexican government seized, took from him, possibly our warrior emperor Tigrinus posed for it. Warrior Emperor Tigrinus' tomb reveals that first red-haired people in all history dwelt in America, and that strange basket makers of prehistoric Utah were kindred people of his tribe. Yes, and like he stated earlier, these auburn red-headed mummies have been found in California, Arizona, Utah, Colorado. Now here we are in New Mexico. I'm going to get into a little bit more of this. We're going to talk about the statue here found in Mexico. We're going to talk a little bit more about this area here, Aztec, New Mexico, and yeah. So hopefully you're intrigued, and stay tuned for the full episode. I look forward to your comments. Thanks again. Bye.